here with my wonderful partner Connor, who just so happens to be a music producer. And I'm going to ask you a few questions. How are you doing tonight?
Doing well, thanks.
Good. Okay, so these are all mostly just about producing and then a couple questions about mastering. It's just four questions. Um, I want to start with um, what is your favorite step in the process of producing a piece of music? Would you say writing, tracking, mixing, mastering? Like, what's your favorite part?
I love mixing. I really do. I think it's just absolutely fascinating and engrossing to think about all of the elements that go into making a mix really good. So thinking about the frequency spectrum and thinking about the stereo field and the depth field and how all of the different elements of the mix can contribute to all of those different aspects of the mix is
Yeah.
just, yeah, I love mixing.
Cool. Totally. That makes sense. I like mixing too. That's when you get to start really experimenting with the way everything sounds. Because
Yeah, exactly.
tracking is a really basic, kind of a really basic process, I feel like a lot of the time. And when you get to start really experimenting is through the mixing process. So I can totally understand why that would be a part that you like so much.
hmm
Okay, question number two. What is something about producing music that you wish people knew? Say an artist that you had to record, like had requests that you're like, I'm sorry, but you don't understand producing music, or something like what's something you wish people understood about producing music?
I think just in general, I wish that non-musicians understood how unbelievably time-consuming every single stage
Oh
of
God, yeah.
making music well takes. So I wish there was a broader, throughout society, a broader acceptance of how much work this is that we
Oh,
do as
totally.
musicians.
I totally agree with that. That and that goes across the whole spectrum of artists in general, right? As people are like, "Oh, can you give me a deal on this painting?" or "Oh, will you play this show for $50?" Like,
Right,
no,
exactly. Yeah.
there's an obscene amount of work that's gone into what's
Yeah.
happening here. It's
hmm
totally an underappreciated uh the people don't see it as having the same kind of value as uh computer labor or manual labor even.
Well, and as a producer, a lot of it is computer labor,
Yeah.
actually. So, you know,
No, that's true. Producers do make decent money when they are working with big labels and stuff, but someone like you and me isn't really going to get paid what they should be,
yeah.
probably ever. So that makes sense. Cool. Okay. What do you find to be the most challenging part of mastering specifically?
Oh, that's an interesting question. I usually leave mastering to someone else. If I when I'm producing tracks that are like my own music, sometimes I'll do kind of my own fake mastering on, stick a limiter on the master bus and some EQ and, look at an imager for the stereo field and see if I'm kind of roughly in the ballpark. But I know that I'm not a mastering engineer, so I leave that. I don't call what I do mastering.
Okay.
I get things to often to a really good mix where I have a mix that I really like, and then I send that to a mastering engineer.
Okay. And that's every time have you ever mastered your own pieces of music?
I do master my own music for release, and I'm happy with that. But I know that I'm not going quite as far as a lot of mastering
Right.
engineers are able to.
So since you can't totally answer the question, I'll ask you what are parts of mastering that you aren't confident in, which would be
Mm-hmm.
the reason why you would be sending them off to get them mastered versus doing it yourself.
Yeah, there's things like average level, where there are standards for that, where I think it's different in different places. Like different places you would release the music, or in different countries, there are different standards for what the average level is supposed to be after
Mhm.
it's been mastered. And I've never studied that deeply enough to be super confident that I'm getting when I do one of my rough masters on my own music. I'm not 100% sure I'm in the ballpark of that sort of thing. So yeah,
Yeah,
getting
that's
the levels to be exactly, to a kind of a scientific standard of average volume.
Yeah, that makes sense. It's like when you're listening to music on Spotify, for example, if you're going through your playlist, there's a really good chance that they're all going to end up being pretty much the same volume.
Yeah,
And
exactly.
if they aren't, if there's a song that's not mastered well, you can usually tell
Yeah, it sticks
like
out.
right
Yeah,
away.
it sounds softer almost always.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, that's cool. Okay. Good to know. Good to know. Good to know. So I have one more question. What is a piece of advice that you would give to someone who is wanting to learn how to do their own production and mixing and mastering and this and that? What would you recommend be some first steps or things that they really
Mhm.
need to learn that are like some of the foundational pieces of knowledge of making your own music? Whether they're instrumentalists or not isn't really as important as like the production part, I guess is what I'm asking.
Sure, yeah. I think thinking of yourself still as a musician is really important for all of these roles. Mastering engineer, mixing engineer, producer, where you go into a studio. This is my main role as a producer, is I go into a studio with, we'll hire 10 classically trained musicians as our chamber orchestra to record like a
Mm-hmm.
film score. That's one of the main producing gigs that I have regularly. And
Mm-hmm.
I have to think of myself as a musician because I'm interacting with musicians. And so not being lazy about musical training, in other words. So it's still really important to know music theory and to be able to communicate with other musicians. So have that foundation in a broad range of musical uh, fields. So being a performer is a really good way to gain a lot of these skills, but
Yeah.
also making sure to learn the music theory that, at least enough to be able to communicate to musicians. And
Right, right.
yeah,
So you
and
think someone who with like zero knowledge of like music structure and this and that, you think that someone with no musical knowledge at all would have an easy time doing something like this? Like someone who's not even an instrumentalist. Like
I think it's rare and very difficult.
yeah. Yeah. People
Yeah.
that are producers, you think most of the time are people with knowledge of music. Well, a lot of them probably went to school for it
Yeah, exactly.
and
Yeah.
had to take those classes that we're all taking.
Yeah.
And how
My impression from interacting with sound engineers and record producers and in different worlds, so like the film world I mentioned, there's also, I've worked in classical music production. Most of these people do have some background playing an instrument or singing or composing one of these things earlier in their uh, careers, and then transitioned into being a producer or a sound engineer or whatever later on.
hmm
But I feel like keeping connected to that, I think, is really important. So
Yeah.
even if you love being a mastering engineer and that's going to be your thing, I think still, having an instrument that you like to pick up from time to time, just
It's good for you.
staying close to that, staying close to the actual playing of music, I think is a really valuable thing to do.
That's cool. That's really interesting. Okay, I have a bonus question. Is that acceptable?
Sure, of course.
So is there a particular type of sound or type of plugin or a specific signature sound, I guess you could say, that you tend to go to or use a lot when you're producing tracks?
Yeah, totally. I'm
Okay.
actually a huge fan of this is a Logic plugin called Delay Designer.
Oh gosh, I've seen I've seen you like, in the master lab working with the delay designer.
Yeah, I love Delay
We
Designer.
used that
It's
for that mandolin piece that we did, didn't we?
exactly right. That's basically why the mandolin piece exists, is Delay Designer.
Yeah, tell me more.
So I just love that it's a delay where you control the each instance of the delay, and it can be rhythmically not it can be not a steady rhythm, and you can pan each delay to a different place. So it's a really powerful tool for, and you can transpose your delays as well. But it's a really powerful tool for. I use it mainly for that ability to spread out a signal across the stereo field,
Okay.
and I really really like being able to make a big space with just, you can take a mono track and suddenly with Delay Designer, with where you pan everything to different places, you can suddenly make this huge space for a sound
Right.
to
Oh yeah.
exist within, and I love that.
Especially when you can take each specific sound bite that comes from this delay, and you can set them to all different types of distances and
Exactly. Hmm.
different panning, so you can really kind of create this huge spectrum of sound just from
Exactly.
one
Yeah. Hmm.
track, right?
Right.
Yeah, it's a
Exactly.
really interesting, a really cool process. um cool, so those are all my questions. Do you have
All
anything
right.
you would
Cool.
like to share to some production students?
Oh boy. I don't know. It's just it's such a broad term, even producer.
Right. Well, okay, so
Um,
we'll say this class is Intro to Audio Production 1. So we've
cool.
learned all about space, rooms, spaces, different types of microphones. We've learned about impulse response. We've learned
Hmm.
about
Cool.
compression and EQ, mixing and mastering. So we've learned basically about all the basics of producing a track of music and the tools
Hmm.
needed to go into that. Um, so this is basically our last bit of the puzzle, is we've learned about mastering, and so that's why I've got mostly questions
Oh,
related
mastering
to
questions.
the
Sure. Yeah.
mastering
Hmm.
process and your recording process. um yeah, I don't know. I just want, what's some of your takeaways? What have been like some of the most rewarding things that you've gotten out of producing music?
Well, it's changed how I compose music.
Oh,
Specifically, I think a lot more about the frequency spectrum and about stereo and depth fields. I already mentioned those, but I'll bring them back up because I'm really into this. If I'm not sure what I'm doing in a composition, like I've got a seed of an idea and I like it, but I'm not sure what to do next. If I just think about how to fill up the space, so, okay, cool, all right, maybe I've got this idea and it starts with one instrument in the middle of the stereo field and it's close to the listener, and I like how that is, but then what happens next? Well, cool. All right. What if I just do something that fills up the stereo field and uses a little bit more of the frequency spectrum than that initial idea? And that's the development of the idea, is to use the space that we have access
right.
to through the music production tools we use. That in and of itself is can be a guide for composing, and that so that was really cool. Actually, I studied composition in college still, and you're taught things like counterpoint and chord progressions and voice leading, and how you develop ideas with basically pitch and rhythm is the only things you think about. And then uh, once I started studying sound engineering and then working more as a producer, I realized that there's this whole other way to think about music, and
Yeah.
being a producer and being a sound engineer taught me a different way to compose. Actually, it taught me a different set of parameters that you can look to make an interesting composition.
That actually makes a lot of sense. And I feel like that reflects in the music that you write based on what I've heard from years past and what I've heard more recently, especially when I think about the one of the pieces you've written most recently where it's written for an entire wind ensemble, and there are all these different tiny little parts that fit together that definitely create one of those like spectrums of depth that you're talking about. So,
Yeah, cool. Hmm.
yeah, I think that that does reflect in your work. That's cool.
Great. I'm glad it does.
Awesome. Cool. Well, thank you so much for letting me ask you some questions and pick your brain. Um, Hopefully, this will be informative and interesting for everyone that watches it. So,
I hope so too.
all right, I'm going to stop recording now.